When the meaning of everything is up for grabs, what does the West mean anymore? Jonathan Pageau is here. I'm James Polis, and this is Zero Hour. Yeah, we're going to clear up the confusion today. Jonathan's here. He's an artist. He's a writer. He's a public speaker. He's the host of the Symbolic World podcast, where he explores symbolic patterns which inform our world. Welcome, Jonathan. So, everyone's super confused right now. And, even symbols that we thought we recognized and we're going to stick around for a long time, it all sort of seems to be melting. Tell us what's going on and how we can find our way out.
Well, a good way to understand what's going on is that we're reaching the end of something or the fringe of something, right? The edge is a good way of understanding it. And the edge of something has a coherence to it. It looks like something. It looks like fragmentation. Sometimes it can look like an excess also of strength, right? Like on the wall of a city where you have the soldiers that are trying to hold out the enemy. And so the edge looks like many things, like the monsters on the edge of the world or the gargoyles on the outside of the church. And the margins of manuscripts, you'd have these hybrid figures that were, kind of represented a world that it doesn't make sense. And we talk about clown world, right? You've heard people talk about it that way. So that's a good way to understand it, is that in some ways we are in a kind of large carnival, and all our civilization has reached a carnival point.
Yeah, it's like one of those funhouse halls of mirrors.
Yeah, that turns into the funhouse of horror.
Yeah, right. That's the thing, is 1 minute you're having a good time and the next minute you're genuinely lost and frightened.
Yeah, and that is, in some ways, the whole aesthetic of the carnival, or the whole aesthetic of the fringe, is that there's a loosening, and that loosening can be expressed as maybe a lot of freedom, a lot of liberty, but also libertinage, like to become... move into excess, into your desire, but that also quickly becomes a kind of breakdown. And that breakdown, because it's funny, you think about, let's say, a good example would be you're out with friends, things are a little loose, it's at the end of the evening, the work day is over, now you're partying, you have a few drinks, and it's a lot of fun, but there's an edge, right? If you tip over that edge, then that fun time drinking turns into you losing your mind, puking in the toilet, right?
Right, getting mugged in the dark alley.
Exactly. And so that is a good way to understand our civilization. Why sometimes it looks like this weird, anything goes party world, and then all of a sudden it flips into despair and despondency. So
yeah, how do people guard themselves against that? I mean, there's one approach, which is ban fun, shut it down. Put the padlocks on everything, super safety, super risk averse. That's kind of become the spiritual response that has become more prominent sort of on the left side of things, which used to not be the case. It used to be like, everyone go nuts all the time.
That's right.
Right. The revolutionary acts of hedonism and perversion. And now even those have kind of been folded into this, like everything's going to basically be like a hospital or a therapy clinic.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating to watch. A good way to see it is as a pendulum, right? So as you reach the edge of something, the pendulum starts to swing wider and wider. And there's something about American society in particular which does seem to swing between extremes, and that's not something that's new. We always have to remember that 100 years ago, alcohol was illegal in the United States. And now we have this other flip side where kind of like this insane party culture after the 60s. We're still at the end of that right now. And we're on the verge. COVID was a little example of a flip back to this crazy purity, right? This desire to keep everything controlled and everything tight. And so I think that the solution is to really explore symbolic thinking and the fullness of it, because traditional societies and traditional cultures, they have a center, they have an identity, they have ways to participate in that, and then they also have formally within their structure something like carnival, right? Something where there are moments of little bit of excess that we let happen. That you have the corners of the field for the stranger. You have the Purim, for example, in the Jewish culture, where the one day where everybody dresses up and is kind of chaotic and drinks until they fall to the ground. And we had Mardi Gras in the West, and these kind of carnival traditions are there to, in some ways, prevent the entire world from moving in these extremes. So understanding the role of, let's say, the role of identity, the role of participation, and then also not being too tight on that, right? Holding it loosely so that you have some room for things to spill over a little, and then they come back to normality.
Yeah,
it's nothing weird that I'm saying. It's just basically, it's like you work during the day, and then in the evening, you have to stop working and just chill and hang out and maybe have a drink, and then you go to bed and you start over. That's just a normal cycle. But if we think about that as a pattern of normal being, where it should be like that for everything, where you have a moment where you're actually working towards the identity, and then you have a moment where you let it go a little, and then you come back. But if you try to work 24 hours a day, and people like that it's like all work, and then, cocaine bender, crazy madness at the end of that all work. It's like, no, that's not, we need to find that normal balance.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like the West, we can talk about exactly what that means. The West has been a place where historically, huge waves of really just chaos and violence, blood ritual, fracturing, fragmenting. You go back to whether it's like an Alexis de Tocqueville or like a Friedrich Nietzsche, who sort of looks at China as the opposite of this, a place of this kind of almost eternal sort of stagnation or rest under this kind of despotism that's just sort of hanging in the air. And they contrast it with, the intense movement and motion and these waves of motion and coming together and breaking apart in the West.
That makes sense, just in terms of even the fact that you identify yourself as the West, the idea that, although obviously the earth is round, but we still have a map in our mind of what is East and what is West. And we have a sense that we are the West. And that's what the West is. The West is the end. The West is the end of the day, right? It's where the sun goes down. And all of that symbolism of that edge, is manifested in our culture. American culture is everything. Right, American culture, I often, because I'm Canadian, and sometimes people say, well, Americans are like that. And I'm like, well, actually, you're right, but also the opposite of what you just said, It's like when you go to California, you find the craziest fringe stuff, but you also find like Orthodox monasteries that are extremely traditional, or like Catholic monasteries, or these communities that are the most traditional you've ever found. And that's what's particular about America, is that in some ways it represents the danger, but also the pregnancy or the possibility of the edge, of moving into that, how can I say this, of something that's at the end, but that also contains a seed that can grow into something new, into a new beginning.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, the possibility of that rebirth.
That's right. And that's not something which is, and you can see it, like it's not something that is as available, I think, even to Europe. When you look at some of the things happening in Europe, in England, in France, you're just watching the sunset. That's what it feels like. You're like, okay, there's a little bit of glimmer of light left, but it's almost done. But in America, there's still, and sometimes it's a difficult thing, but there's still the bubbling, and still the discussion, and still the tension is still there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any question that, especially just kind of looking at Europe and where is this going? Does anyone remember, who they are? Yeah. So much of this has to do with identity. And so we get this, there's a lot of talk now about saving the West. This is the time we need to sort of come together and find a way to save the West. But if you can't identify the West, then how are you supposed to save it?
Yeah, exactly. That makes a lot of sense. I think that the West will be saved to some extent when it will be able to look to the East to some, and that sounds weird the way that I said that, but what I mean is that there is an aspect of the West which is this stable, right? For example, I do believe that, let's say, Christian culture, Christianity in the West has been, for all the fractiousness of the story of the West, has been something which has been a marker that follows through, right? It's like if there's one line that follows through, it is Christianity. Even in the religious wars, even when it was breaking down, there's that line. And I think that looking towards that stability, finding those places that carry that stability, will be a way to help us, if not save the West, at least build an ark, right? At least gather together enough so that if things really start to collapse, then there'll be a new, because collapse also brings a new world after it. So
hopefully.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously there's also always the nuclear holocaust possibility, but it's probably best not to think about that because, what are you going to do? You just we can only do what we can do right now, which is, in terms of, this is the way that I approach it, which is, in a world of internationalism, like in a world where identity is being fragmented and being kind of carried in that direction, the one thing we can do is act around us. And that sounds trite, but, to be a good father, right? To be a good husband, to be a member of your parish, to be a member of your community, to be someone who knows their neighbors, someone who helps their neighbors. All these things are absolutely accessible to everybody all the time.
Yeah.
And in a time when things are falling apart, it's those true anchors that they'll carry through, because they're real.
Well, and that's about humility too, right?
Yeah.
Which is, no matter what, you have to keep doing these things. Even if you get really good at doing some things that are higher order or smarter or more abstract or, addressed to the world as such instead of to your own home or your own family, if you neglect those things, you're just cutting yourself off at the roots.
And I think the online world and the media world has made it, of course, difficult because we're constantly being put images of world conflicts in front of us. It's like, why I'm paying attention to this war in Ukraine. I'm paying attention to this war in Israel. There's absolutely nothing I can do about this. And when we talk about global warming or these huge, world crises, I just feel crushed. And rightly so. And I don't want to say that those things aren't important. They are important, and we should keep them on our horizon, but we should have the right hierarchy, which is that there are places where I can act, right? And then I can be a force for good. And that's how the world changes ultimately, is to be that where you can be. And if you can have influence on those larger issues, then great, but most of us obviously don't.
I think so many people, faced with that problem, come to the conclusion that there actually is something they can do about it, maybe even something they have to do about it, and that's talk about it.
That's right.
Just relentlessly talk about it, critique it, argue about it, describe it, explain it. So much of economic life seems to be getting sucked into this idea that no one can really do anything anymore except just kind of fill the air with as many words as possible. And, here I am
That's right. That's what we contributing
to contributing more words. Right. And at least my words are about the words, the surplus of words problem. It's understandable, but it's also making it hard to experience life in a non-verbal way.
Yeah.
Even looking at AI, well, what's that? What are all these machines that are going to sort of automate life for us? They're large language models. Yeah. They're just talk boxes. Yeah. And everything that they spit out at us is just kind of a compilation of everything they see in that funhouse of mirrors, all of the words, all of the word clouds that come out of all of the people, and they sort of distill that down. Maybe some of our identity problem that everyone seems to be suffering through has to do with the fact that we can't understand who we are in a world that is constantly filled with words.
I agree. I think it's also because something happened, in the intellectual history of the West, that we did move up here quite a bit. And so because of that, we tend to forget that identity is participation. It's not actually totally who you think you are or how you think about yourself. It's where you are and how you participate in that world. And so identity is something that you engage in. And so it's actually singing the national anthem, for example, in the United States. It's much closer to identity than thinking about what we are. Like I said, volunteering for something, participating in the world that you're in, being a father, being a husband, being a part of your community. That then when you do that, like in practice, a lot of the identity problems just go away.
Yeah.
You actually don't have time to think about it too much because, if you have kids and you're taking care of your kids, you obviously are trying to do the best thing you can, but you don't have the energy to spend your time thinking about, what abstractly is a father. It's like, no, just feed, sleep, take care of, keep warm, do those things, make sure they've got everything. And that's more of I think that's closer to how identity functions, which is why I believe that that ritual, for example, is a good way to engage identity more than activism or more than talking about it. That let's say going to church or having a family meal, celebrating the holidays, celebrating Christmas, celebrating Thanksgiving, celebrating the things. These are the ways in which our identities are formed because they ground space, they create borders, they create natural inside spaces that we engage in, and that's what identity is made of.
Yeah, the national anthem thing is such an interesting case because a lot of people have thoroughly memorized the national anthem. A lot of people haven't, and you're sort of bombs burst, and then say people can lock into that, and you don't have to have it memorized.
No.
You don't have to be an expert in the phraseology of the national anthem in order to partake of it and stand there with everyone else, your hat to your chest, and
but that's
go through
really,
it.
and you can see that for example, the attack on the national anthem that happened a few years ago in all these sports events, that is a sign of identity fragmentation, because identity and being something and participating something never means that you agree with everything that ever happened in the history of the thing you're in. I am Pageau and I come from a line of people and a family, and I assume that, and I'm happy for that, but it doesn't mean that everything that everybody's ever done in my family lineage is worthy of praise. And I think that that's something that's why I'm saying that when we think about, when we're too critical, too analytical, then we have this issue. And it has to do, in America, it has to do definitely with this weird purity thing. It's like our national heroes, or your national heroes, in Canada we have the same problem, but your national heroes, they basically have to be gods, or they have to be perfect, or else they have to be thrown out. But that's not true participation and true relationship. It's the same with your own parents. Your parents are imperfect and you love them, and you're not an idiot. You're aware of their imperfections. You're aware of the things they've done wrong and the mistakes that they've made, but it doesn't mean that you toss them out, because you're going to be judged by that standard as well if you're not careful. And if you get rid of the national heroes of America, for example, who are you going to replace them with? Because even the people you want to replace them with, they all have their dark skeletons in their closet. They all have dark secrets. Can't avoid it. That's what being human is.
Yeah, we already tried this before people started melting down statues and taking the knee and everything, and it was called celebrity culture.
Right.
That's who we replaced the heroes with, and it's exactly what you're talking about, where you elevate them to this impossible sort of simulated deity status, and then you make the inevitable discovery that they are imperfect and impure, and then you exact revenge on them, sort of kill them, tear them down, throw them down. And then get that sort of perverse satisfaction out of that. And it was only a matter of time before what happened, which is people start applying this kind of psychosis, this psychodrama to themselves. And they think, my wedding day, I have to be a princess, I have to be a literal princess. Or, if I'm not the perfect sort of embodiment of this role or that role, then it's just straight to the self-loathing. It's the slightest strain in a relationship and the relationship breaks.
Broken. Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it. And you see, the marriage one is interesting too, because you see it, people who wait years because they want the perfect wedding. And they're they're saving up and they're and they're having this whole thing where they're, and it's what do you think a wedding is? Of course weddings should be beautiful and great, but it's mostly two people engaging themselves, ritualistically with their community towards a relationship. And that's what I mean by the participative aspect is more important than the image that we have of it, or the abstract idea that we have of this perfect thing.
Yeah, some of the most important stuff that takes place is invisible.
Yeah. But it's possible too that the online world has made all of this more difficult, because in a normal world, or in the ancient world, you knew, because the people around you, they're part of your life. You see their foils, you see all their problems all the time. But Instagram is like a horrible mask, right? Where you can just show this glorious image of yourself, and everybody's just voyeuristically looking at other people's amazing lives and have a sense that that actually exists.
Yeah. Well, there is this expectation. There's always this kind of lag. So you create the internet and you say, this is amazing. It's going to be like the ultimate library. And then as time goes on, the number of books in that library seems somehow to start shrinking, or, every book that you pull off the shelf starts to look strangely, increasingly similar to every other book.
Yeah.
And you look at Instagram and the beauty standards on Instagram, they're trying so hard to say, no, you can be as sort of, as big of a mutant. You can disfigure yourself as much as possible, and that's beautiful too. But what's really happening is the vast majority is just sort of coalescing around this kind of,
whatever Kim Kardashian is
alien-esque,
doing. Yeah.
Kardashian-esque, just sort of extremely, it's like when they would do those composites of, we took every race in the world and sort of turned it into one face, and it's kind of becoming that one face.
The funniest
one, incredible uniformity.
The craziest thing is when you encounter, and it's probably happened to you, is that they have these makeup tutorials that girls love, and they do these makeup tutorials, and basically the makeup tutorial is actually something which only exists in a camera. That is, the way that they're doing their makeup is meant for a camera, not meant for real life. And then you walk around and you see people that have done that to their face in real life. And so you're standing in front of someone who looks like an absolute mutant, like you said, but it's only because when they look at themselves on their phone, they look great. Like when they take a picture, they look great because it's made for the camera. It's wild.
Yeah, it's like the same sort of thing where, you focus so much on what seem to be these higher order things or this higher level of abstraction or scale that you neglect the roots, and the roots die.
Yeah.
We've got people now who are optimizing for the shimmering visage of the disincarnate avatar.
Yeah.
And the foundation of that, what's supposed to be the root of the image is hacked away, and you're just left with this kind of floating mask.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow.
You mentioned a little bit earlier that at some point somehow the West kind of just moved up into the head or into the brain, and I hope we can talk a little bit about exactly what that was, and how it unfolded and became so powerful.
Well, it's very cliche to say that now, but it does seem to start at the end of the Middle Ages. Nominalism seems to be the first glimmer of that, where basically you put God up so high, right? This was Occam's idea, was that in some ways we make God completely untouchable. So because of that, the causalities down here become accidental to divine will, and so you have God and you have the world, and there's this separation between the two. And I think that that's the movement of extreme that we have in the West, and it obviously starts with God and reality, but then it ends up being like mind and body, and then it ends up being a kind of insane, like kind of Descartes cogito attitude towards thinking, and at the same time developing extremely precise, descriptions of the mechanical causalities in the world. And you have this opposition. It takes different forms. It can also take the form of extreme subjectivity, then extreme objectivity, where you have these opposites, or where this idea that you have this purely internal world that is completely, closed off and, inaccessible to anything and anyone. And then that is the opposite of this material world that's outside. And all these ideas still infect us today, right? The idea of self-identification that we see right now is just one of the latest side effects of that type of opposition, where we think that your subjectivity is completely, completely belongs to you, and is completely something that you completely self-define in your own little inner experience. And that has nothing to do with all the external realities of your body, of the people around you, of like your role. None of that matters. It's just this. So I think that's a little line. Obviously it's very simplified what I just said, but it's a good way to kind of understand how once you separate, I think that real Christian metaphysics is incarnational, right? And this idea that God came into the world, became man, and then that's a hook. It's this place where heaven and earth meet, where all the things that are abstract, that are invisible, all the patterns, all the names, all the things that don't have body are united actually with their body. And I think that was the great medieval synthesis, was that idea that that's actually how the world works, and God manifests himself in the world in different ways, and the world is a reflection of God's glory. And what we have then is this starts to a kind of de-incarnation seems to happen in the West, where we start to separate the earth and heaven, and we start to move in those two directions simultaneously, and it leads to the pendulum. And the pendulum has different forms, not always the same, but that kind of what later will be called the dialectic, this dialectical thinking in Hegel and Marx, which is part of this. It's kind of viewing the world in these opposite, like oppressor, oppressed. There's nothing in between. There's no, the normal hierarchy of participation is gone, and it's just these two extremes that are fighting each other.
It's so important because there is this movement, this intellectual movement in the West of intellectuals who say the West is basically intellectual dumb. And so I, as an intellectual, I'm going to save the West by saving the intellectuals. And what that means is, the most important thing to do is to identify which smart people are making weak arguments. And, to describe the problems that we're experiencing as the result of the smart people making bad arguments. And so, I can be a smarter person who can make a better argument. And the argument that they end up making is like, well, we just need to get better at being smarter.
Yeah.
And if you get the smartest people together and have them talk about stuff, then that's where truth comes from. And once you know what the truth is, because you trust the smartest people to use the best words to sort of uncover this thing, then that's your path for progress.
Yeah.
And so all of that kind of spiritual question about, well, are we forgetting the heart? Are we forgetting the body? Are we getting sort of lost or trapped somehow in our heads? All of that sort of gets flipped.
Yeah.
And, of course, I'm not here to say that, being intelligent is bad or being an intellectual, you stop that, but these are deep-seated, deep-rooted arguments. For the Orthodox, you can go back to Barlaam versus Palamas, and that debate between, is philosophy this kind of disincarnate thing that can explain everything to you, and is who we are ultimately a matter of explanation, and is our trust in our fellow man ultimately based on, who we trust to provide the explanations of everything.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. A simple line to kind of understand it, you can see the early church fathers, they would always say, the theologian is he who prays, right? That's what a theologian is. And now we have the theologian is an expert who's done like a PhD and a dissertation and like works for university. And maybe he doesn't believe in God. He's still a theologian because he's the expert, And I think that that's a difference. And it is in some ways a difference between wisdom and just knowledge or just understanding, where we have a lot of understanding now, and we have a lot of capacity to explain things and to describe them, but we have put aside the notion of wisdom, which is which path should we be following. We don't ask ourselves the question of why should we do, especially in the technological world. Like nobody is ever asking the question, like, should we do this? It's always, if we can, we will. And if we can increase power for anything, then we just do it. It's a natural good. There's no thought of what's the path that we actually have to follow.
Well, and even less attention to what environment do we need to be in order for us to properly even pose the question of whether or not we should do something. Much of prayer, perhaps the deepest prayer, requires silence.
Yeah.
And if you're asking these, good questions, even the right questions, in an atmosphere of noise and of this kind of gratuitousness of words, if you don't have silence to inhabit, and if you're not forced to experience what you have to go through and feel, the patience, among other things, some certain kind of discomfort of silence. If you don't have the discipline of silence, then you're not going to hear what can only be heard in silence.
Yeah. We are frenetically running around. That is 100% sure. But I think that it's an interesting time. Simultaneously, is that in some ways we're seeing the extremes manifest themselves. Like we're seeing this extreme kind of hedonistic world, still shimmering, but also falling apart into kind of Me Too kind of let's say, tyrannies and stuff like that. So you can see the both. Like people are extremely hedonistic, but also extremely scared of hedonism because it leads obviously to abusive things. And so you can see that happening. And you can also, people are also noticing like their families fall apart, their communities fall apart. And the COVID, I think, was huge in terms of helping people see where we are. It's like it was a wake up for a lot of people to think, oh, okay, oh wait. That's what technology can be used for. Technology can be used to shut us in our houses for like a year or 2 years in some places. And technology can be used to track me, and I fell into the worst thing during COVID where I was being tracked by the government and they were forcing me to like a prisoner, right, every day to like check in because I was supposedly in quarantine, but there was some problem. And so I was getting threats of being put to jail for like 6 months, 3 years, $1 million fines.
It's irregular purity test.
It was absolutely crazy. But I think for a lot of people, it woke them up. And what we've been seeing now since around that time is there's a resurgence, at least in the Orthodox Church, for example. Like there's a lot of people going back to church. And a lot of atheists, a lot of secular people that are converting or at least, even if they're not necessarily explicitly converting, they're at least not hostile anymore towards Christianity and towards religion. And I think that in some ways it's inevitable because as things start to fragment and to collapse, then there will always be a sounding alarm for people to kind of look. So right now you can see it. I mean, the rebel teenager who basically wants to get married and have children and have a family and do the things that were actually completely normal, and that this happens almost as a rebellion against the madness that is surrounding us. So I think there are hopeful signs and there are hopeful glimmers. And it's the same with art, for example. Like, the madness of Hollywood and all the kind of ideological capture that they've been going through for the past, 5-6 years, probably way more than that, is now collapsing under its own weight because people don't care. Like people actually don't want to pay money to go watch someone preach some ideological thing at them. So because of that, there are new pockets that are opening for possibly speaking back into culture in ways that were nearly impossible 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And, I'd go even a little bit further, being kind of close to that world in some respects. It's not just audiences who are looking at, there's sort of like woke clickbait or fan service, whatever you want to call it, on the one hand, and then just sort of CGI slop on the other, and saying like, there must be something more, like this is not what art is about. Yeah. This is not what I, as an incarnate, ensouled human being, not that they're using these terms, but
it's an intuitive thing. It's an intuitive thing.
Also creators feel this way. Yeah. Also people who are in the industry, they don't want to devote their lives to ensuring that, the fashionable identity of the month is appropriately featured in the rank order of identities in the film that they're working on. And they don't want to just sort of surrender their agency and their artistic fluency to machines. Yeah. And so what that means is right now, production in Hollywood has dropped by at least 40% this year. But there are lots of folks who are sitting around hoping, wishing, wanting there to be creative, artistic projects of some sophistication, but, not reinventing the wheel, where the natural or inherent purpose of art, spiritually speaking, is returned to the production of things that people actually do want to watch, that they do want to sit down in front of.
Yeah, so I think that, because we have a lot of doomsaying, and it's fine because we are in a crisis. But I think it's important to notice exactly what you said. And it's important not only to notice it, but to make the most of it, and to, I have a bunch of artists and creative people that are, I'd say, around me. And there's a kind of jubilation, really, because they're also encountering each other, meeting each other, trying to notice who are the people that care about good stories, who are the people that care about making beautiful things. And in a world of fasting, like basically in a desert. When you see something, it's like an oasis. So there's this excitement to say, oh, we could collaborate, we could work together, we could try to move. And in some ways, the technology in this case can actually be an advantage because distribution is not as difficult as it was, for, let's say, my parents' time, where basically there were just a few gatekeepers that were controlling everything. There are ways now to distribute art and to distribute stories that are more accessible. And so people who have the talent and the capacity and also the desire to make beautiful things that are meaningful, they have a chance right now.
Yeah, there's always a mirage here or there in the desert, but it can also give you that incredible clarity, being able to quickly distinguish what is a source of life and what is withering.
Yeah, what is just something that's an illusion for sure.
But you're working on a few creative projects yourself, targeted toward maybe younger audiences than what the average intellectual is accustomed to. Tell us a little bit about those before you're out.
So, I mean, this is the thing I'm actually the most excited about. What I'm doing now is, one of the things I noticed several years ago was I love fairy tales. I love fairy tales since I was a child. I love telling fairy tales to my kids. And I noticed that Disney, for example, was dropping the fairy tales. And I could tell for a while it's been kind of happening. But Snow White, this Snow White project that they have, it was like, this was going to be a flashpoint. And I knew this 3 years ago because I knew they were going to do it for the 100th anniversary. I'd found out kind of through the grapevine, and I knew they couldn't make it. I think they can't make this. So I thought, what an opportunity to take those stories, like to take them back and to do it in a way, because now for about 2 or 3 generations, fairy tales have been treated with cynicism. So you have Shrek, for example, is a good example where you have this mismatch of like all these fairy tales jammed together into a kind of symphony of fairy tales, but it's all cynical. It's all kind of exposing the sexuality of it, exposing the darker aspects. And you have adult version like Into the Woods, or what is the Wizard of Oz one? I forget.
Wicked.
Yeah, Wicked, right. And then Disney also started making all these like bad guy movies where the main character is the evil person. And I thought, it seems like now's the time to re-celebrate these stories, to do them in a way that doesn't ignore the sophistication of what the postmodern moment has brought to us, because there is a kind of clarity of looking at the fairy tale and seeing it, from a distance that can help you see things that, the old grandmother telling those tales to her child didn't necessarily see. So can we create a sophisticated version of these fairy tales that is totally accessible to a 4-year-old, but that also an adult can read and get that adult level reading? But now it's not the dirty jokes of Shrek, and it's not the cynical, it's actually insight, right? It can bring you insight into what these stories are for and what they're doing. And so
you've got 1 or 2 of them. Tell people where they can find them.
So people can go to symbolicworld.com, and we have a store there, and we started selling. We have Snow White and the Widow Queen, and we're just putting out Jack and the Fallen Giants with the Jack and the Beanstalk. We're going to do 8 in all, 8 fairy tales.
And these are in book form or graphic novel? Or?
We're going totally against the grain. These are beautifully bound books with foiling and cloth bounding and everything. We're making these little treasures that people will just love and we want to keep and to pass down to their kids and their grandkids. So that's the aim, that's the bet we're making, is that instead of going cheap and digital and just, we're actually going towards high quality, beautiful illustrations, everything paid attention to.
I, for one, think that is exactly the right approach. I would say that. I did a limited edition of my book, Human Forever. Leather bound, foil stamped, all the pretty sort of marbling on the inside jacket, and hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And we just tested the market, and guess what? The appreciation is there. There's a hunger, that people have, and it's not everyone, but it doesn't need to be everyone.
No, and I think it's also because we're so full of fake stuff. Like everything, this plastic world that we live in, everything is so accessible all the time.
Yeah.
And like you said,
disposable by design.
Yeah. To do a limited edition of something and say, this is precious. This is actually something that, you have to put a little more thought into buying because it's going to cost you a bit. But it makes people feel like they're participating. And that just makes people feel like they're participating. They are, right? It is a kind of participation in culture. It's saying, I stand by this. And I want this to be something that's a little brighter than all the other junk that's in my world. And so that, put it on the table, people notice it, and it's also moving away from the de-incarnation of the online world. For some time people thought that people would just live in the metaverse and buy, digital objects and pay fortunes for digital artwork to hang on in their digital houses and wear 3D glasses. Like, that's not, people don't want that. Maybe a few freaks want that, but the most people will not be willing to live in that world. People like real things that feel heavy and have a weight to them. And I think that that's the right move. Yeah.
So last question, we talked about a sort of creative renaissance, talked a little bit about a spiritual renaissance or a resurgence of hope in the culture. As a Canadian, you've spent a lot of time in the UK and in Europe, and of course here in the US and probably other parts of the Anglosphere. Stepping back and sort of looking, from the standpoint of coming out of COVID and everything, how about the political piece? Do you have hope or confidence as someone who's kind of experienced life across the Anglosphere that the West is going to turn it around this year?
This year? I don't know if it's this year. I think
it's an election year in more than one place. It does seem like things are coming to a head.
Yeah. So I think that there's definitely are signs of hope. There are signs of hope in Europe, by the way. And I think even in Canada, there are signs of hope. It seems like, for example, in Canada, it seems like Pageau might get in, and people are tired of the kind of inane madness that Trudeau has been spewing for years now. And so, and he's like, I think it's like the most disliked prime minister in the history of Canada at this point. And so it feels like there's a chance, Of course, the danger is to flip, because this is also the issue with the West, is that we have this pendulum. Like, we go from Weimar to the Reich. It's like, let's, can we have something nice in that's a little reasonable in the middle? Like, can we have something that is, that is both celebratory of identity and participation, but then also has a kind of flexibility, right? So that's what I hope. That's my hope, is that even the movements that we see towards the right in Europe will be healthy, balanced ones, right? And that we won't be pushed into the kind of Spanish Civil War type extremes that we've seen in the past centuries. That's my hope.
Yeah. Well, we talked about that little pressure release that whether it's, Carnival or going to a movie and, experiencing that kind of, mixture of joy and suffering and meeting the creator and the audience in the same place. But, I think if we're going to get there sort of out of that swing between extremes, a touch of stillness, a touch of silence, these things can go a long way.
I totally agree. That's a great way to think about it. Like, sit with your family. Family meals, I think, are a great way to find that. It's a very simple way to live in the world and just be anchored and find that normal balance, find that discipline of time together and the rhythm of relationships, and like you said, to just sit there, actually, In the Orthodox tradition, we have the Jesus prayer, which is like a mental prayer that you say. You just sit in silence, you just repeat the prayer. These are totally key because we're in a whirlwind, so we definitely have to find the center.
I was trying to drift off to sleep last night, and I've been in a couple different time zones over the past 48 hours. So I found a YouTube 10-hour supercut of the Jesus prayer in melodic form, and there is a way of reconciling these things.
Right. And did it put you to sleep?
Eventually.
Eventually.
Yeah. Jonathan Pageau, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, James. It's great.
All right, that's all the time we got. Till next time around, I am James Polis. This is Zero Hour, and may God have mercy on us all.